Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking Peter L. Bernstein's absolute classic, Against the Gods, the remarkable story of risk. Now, what if I told you that literally every single decision you make, whether it's mapping out a massive career move or, just looking both ways before you cross the street, is rooted in a concept that entirely shaped human progress? That concept is risk. Bernstein's book digs into this absolutely fascinating idea that human history completely leveled up the moment we learned to measure, understand, and actually embrace uncertainty. We essentially took a totally chaotic world and figured out how to inject calculation and control right into the mix.
Think about it for a second. What assumptions in your own life are based on pure superstition rather than, say, actual logic? It's kind of a heavy question, right? Because before we had the math to calculate odds, humans were totally reliant on gut feelings. Or worse, this terrifying belief that our fates were just completely out of our hands. So I'd love for you to keep that question right in the back of your mind as we use this incredible history to unpack our own everyday behavior.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. We're going to start with Section 1, from superstition to science. Then hit Section 2, the birth of probability. After that, we'll get into Section 3, markets, growth, and chaos, explore Section 4, the psychology of loss, and then we'll wrap the whole shebang up with Section 5, the paradox of risk.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, from superstition to science, looking at the ancient world. So before we had actual numbers and probabilities to make sense of things, people chalked up all the wild, unpredictable stuff in the world to the whims of the gods, or just blind fate. Imagine living back then, where massive events, like a devastating flood or a sudden amazing harvest, were seen purely as divine punishments or blessings. Bernstein points out that without any tools to measure uncertainty, ancient civilizations basically just threw their hands up and accepted that they were at the total mercy of supernatural forces.
But then, we hit this monumental turning point, the rise of mathematics. Over in ancient Greece, you had thinkers like Pythagoras, and later on in the Arab world, brilliant minds like Ali. These guys started laying the absolute groundwork for rational thought. They began pushing back against that old, scary idea that we're all just helpless pawns in the universe. And really, that is where the story of risk begins, with simple human curiosity. It was people finally asking why things happen and trying to spot patterns hidden inside the chaos.
Which perfectly cues up Section 2, the birth of probability, and those massive Renaissance breakthroughs. The real paradigm shift happened a bit later, and surprisingly enough, it was driven by the gamblers and mathematicians of the Renaissance. We're talking heavy hitters here, like Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat. They essentially formalized probability theory, and I'm not exaggerating when I say their genius changed the entire trajectory of human history.
And the craziest part, they did it by trying to settle a gambling dispute. It's this famous mathematical puzzle called the problem of points. Basically, it asks, how do you fairly split the pot if a game of chance is suddenly interrupted before anyone actually wins? Yeah, the bedrock of modern probability was born because some guys wanted to know who got paid when their game got cut short. It sounds like a petty argument between friends, right? But solving this exact puzzle is what taught us how to mathematically map out multiple different future outcomes.
Talk about a real game changer. We went straight from crossing our fingers and relying on gut feelings to making cold, hard, evidence-based decisions. For the first time ever, humans had the ability to actually calculate the likelihood of an event before it happened. It completely transformed risk from this terrifying, mysterious monster into a totally manageable opportunity. Because think about it, if you know the odds, you can make a rational choice instead of just closing your eyes and hoping for the best.
Moving right along to Section 3, markets, growth, and chaos, and the sheer power of pooling. Once we actually cracked the code on probability, entire new industries just exploded. We realized we could take risk and turn it into this incredibly powerful engine for massive economic growth.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how these practical applications played out. Take insurance, for example. Groups like Lloyd's of London pioneered the concept of pooling resources to manage risk. So this thing that used to terrify everyone suddenly became a catalyst for innovation. And over in finance, we saw the birth of complex tools like stock options and derivatives. These let investors actually hedge against their losses, which democratized wealth in a huge way. But, and it's a big but, they also introduced completely new, highly complex layers of risk into the system.
And naturally, that brings us to the dark side of the equation. Bernstein's lessons map perfectly onto the 2008 financial crisis. Those advanced derivatives we just talked about? Well, they were brilliant when they were designed, but they ended up being wildly misunderstood and, frankly, totally misused. It's a brutal reminder that simply managing risk isn't enough. You actually have to understand it. Risk itself isn't the villain, But if you lose respect for the math and the reality on the ground, things can spiral into absolute chaos.
Which brings us to Section 4, the psychology of loss, and why, despite all our progress, we still mess up. You're probably wondering, if we have all this advanced math and centuries of probability theory, why are we still making terrible choices? Well, enter human psychology. Because even with the best tools in the world, our emotions are constantly muddying the waters and clouding our judgment.
The biggest culprit here is a little thing called loss aversion. It's this core behavioral principle that says humans fear losing something way, way more than we actually desire gaining that same thing. This idea was championed by the brilliant behavioral economists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They basically proved that our own brains are hardwired to fight against pure logic, which, as you can guess, leads to some really poor decision-making.
So, the crucial point is, think about a situation we've all been in, like holding onto a losing investment way too long. Imagine you've got a tanking stock, but you just can't bring yourself to sell it because you're desperately hoping it bounces back. That is not you calculating probability. That is purely your emotional bias taking the wheel. Because honestly, admitting defeat often hurts our ego a lot more than the actual financial hit. Bernstein makes it clear, if you want to master risk, you actually have to master yourself first.
Let's bring it all home with Section 5, the paradox of risk, and the delicate art of balancing innovation with reality. Because look, understanding risk isn't just some neat historical trivia. It's the exact fuel that drove the Industrial Revolution and powers today's massive tech leaps. We're using things like AI and predictive data analytics right now to process mind-blowing amounts of information and completely reshape how we handle risk.
But man, it is a delicate tightrope walk. On one end of the spectrum, you have the Wright brothers. They looked uncertainty right in the face and took massive, yet highly calculated risks. If they hadn't, human flight would have never happened. But on the flip side, you have the devastating Challenger space shuttle disaster. In that case, there was this dangerous over-reliance on mathematical models that tragically underestimated the actual physical dangers of faulty components. And that perfectly highlights Bernstein's sternest warning in the book. Numbers alone can't predict everything, never lose sight of reality. It's such a critical reminder. I don't care how advanced our AI gets or how complex our risk models are, they absolutely must be grounded in real-world complexity and plain old human intuition. Use the tools for sure, but never blindly trust a spreadsheet over what's actually happening in front of you.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive paradox we face as a society. Lean too hard into overregulation, and you completely stifle innovation and stop people from creating. But swing the pendulum too far toward reckless risk-taking, and you end up with market crashes and total chaos. We're constantly trying to navigate this tension. Because to achieve any kind of freedom, financial, creative, whatever it is, you literally have to take risks. Finding that sweet spot between security and freedom is the ultimate challenge.
So how do we actually use all this history in our day-to-day lives? Well, here is a quick, actionable, 3-step playbook straight from the book. Step 1, master your own biases. Catch yourself when loss aversion is making you act out of fear instead of logic. Step 2, calculate the odds. Do your homework, use the math we've spent centuries perfecting, and look at the actual evidence. And step 3, step outside your comfort zone. Real progress always demands taking a calculated leap into the unknown.
At the end of the day, risk is a tool. Against the Gods is way more than just a dry history of numbers. It's this awesome celebration of human ingenuity. We started out in this terrifying universe where we felt totally powerless. And using nothing but curiosity and some math, we learned how to turn pure uncertainty into boundless opportunity.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought as we wrap up today's explainer. As you go out and navigate your own life, will you embrace uncertainty to chase down your dreams, or are you going to let fear hold your back? Just remember, risk is a tool. If you use it wisely and calculate your odds, it can open up some truly incredible doors for you. Thanks for joining me, and I really hope this inspires you to step out there and turn your own risks into rewards.